Folks, I think we are going to get going here. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for this community practice call looking at coordinated access prioritization in practice. And we have an amazing panel of folks here from communities that have been implementing prioritization practices who have graciously offered to join us and share their experiencing and developing prioritization in their communities. My name is Morrison. I'm the Director of Built for Zero Canada with Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I'm your host for today's webinar. And our facilitator is none other than Iain Jong with OrgCode Consulting, who is not only an expert on this topic, but an expert facilitator who will be leading our conversation today. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement from coast to coast to coast. We acknowledge, oh, sorry, I just had a moment there. We acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I'm located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the neutral peoples whose presence on this land continues to this day. And I'm going to let Iain say hi and do a land acknowledgement as well.
Yes, good day, everybody. OrgCode is situated on the treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas, neutral, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee. We acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land whose footsteps have marked this land for time immemorial.
Wonderful, thank you, Iain. This webinar is being brought to you today from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. This webinar is part of a series of monthly webinars and community practice calls through the Canadian Alliance that have been taking place since the fall of 2019 and are going to March of 2022. The calendar for January to March will be released soon, and you can find all the webinars and community practice calls, both those coming up and previous ones, on this training and technical assistance website. This by name list and coordinated access support for communities is funded in part through the Government of Canada through the CCI funding stream of Reaching Home. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Folks are always wondering, are we recording? Yes, we are recording, and afterwards we'll send out the PDF of the presentation and the recording to all those who have registered. Closed captioning should be enabled, and I think you can choose to view that or not. You can ask questions through the chat or question function. Everyone is muted to start. We really do encourage you to use the chat, though, to share your ideas or to highlight something that you're hearing, share links to things in your community, and just keep the dialogue going in the chat. So just wanted to start, before we jump into our panel discussion, just to cover two slides to kind of ground us in this topic of prioritization. The first slide includes the definition of prioritization, the longer one from Reaching Home, which is that we have clear processes that both connect clients with appropriate resources and help communities to reach their goals. The prioritization criteria the community chooses determines a client's rank order on the waiting list for housing resources using information gathered through triage and assessment. Clients that meet one or more of the prioritization criteria are sorted closer to the top of your priority list, and clients that meet fewer criteria are sorted closer to the bottom. And when implemented successfully, communities will be able to explain how clients are prioritized for limited resources based on the outcomes that they want to see over time. And this is what communities on our panel today have done that you will soon see. OrgCode has a more succinct definition that is prioritization is the process and action of deciding the relative importance and urgency of serving one household ahead of another based on transparent and defensible criteria. The Coordinated Access Scorecard through the Canadian Alliance question 13.3 on prioritization includes the Reaching Home minimum requirements. And you can see those there, that each type of housing resource in the Coordinated Access Resource Inventory has prioritization criteria and the order in which they will be applied, and it's been documented. So the scorecard also includes some continuous improvement elements that if you are outlining or have different prioritization factor for different populations, that these are also outlined and documented, and that you revisit your prioritization criteria on an annual basis. You can find out more information about that in the Coordinated Access scorecard guide on prioritization. There's links to resources and further description. I do want to highlight 2 previous webinars that we've had on this topic. The first was sort of a prioritization 101 that Iain did in January of 2020, and the recording and the PDF are there. And just last week, we did prioritization 201, focusing on dynamic prioritization. And so that information is linked there as well. And the prioritization examples document, which includes 7 communities coordinated access examples, including many of the folks that are on the panel today. And I am just going to put the link to that prioritization document into our chat so that you can follow along as well as our panel is presenting today. So I just put that into the chat for you now. So our panel today, I'm very happy to welcome representatives from these 6 communities, Alex from Durham, Michelle Corley from Kawartha Haliburton, Don Wheaton from Moncton, Erin Forrest from Peterborough, Shayla and Ryan from Red Deer, and Pat Fisher from Waterloo Region. Thank you all very much for being on the call today and being part of our panel. And you can also see here just a bit of a summary of their prioritization approach. Just again, as so they're talking and sharing, you can kind of follow along just with a little bit about what their information looks like there. Iain has prepared a number of questions for the panel today that he is going to walk through. I'm just showing this quickly so you know that it's in the slide deck, but really I'm going to take us back to this and we're going to kind of just rest on this slide while we have our panel conversation today. And Iain, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marie. And again, a very good day, everybody. Thank you for participating, and a special thank you to our panelists who are going to share their knowledge, expertise, insights, the lessons they've learned, the things that have worked, and even some of the things that haven't. It should be a time of honest reflection and sharing, and hopefully will be of benefit to those organizations and communities that are in different processes and stages of moving ahead with prioritization, and in particular, implementing dynamic prioritization. I want to start today by looking at the process for establishing the criteria and components to be considered in dynamic prioritization. And I'm going to ask Alexandra from Durham Region to kick us off. What process did Durham Region use to establish a criteria and components to be considered in your dynamic prioritization process, Alexandra?
So we used a process that was actually provided to us after meeting with OrgCode. We rolled out our by name list right in the midst of the pandemic, so it was June 2020. So we did everything virtually. So we held specific prioritization meetings with stakeholders for each population. So one for single adults and families, and then one for youth providers specifically. And during the meetings, we asked participants to write down just for themselves any prioritization criteria that they could think of in 2 minutes. So anything that they wanted, chronically homeless, length of time homeless, age, anything like that. We then asked the participants to review what they wrote down and then rank their top 3 in order, with 1 being their most important top prioritization criteria. We gave them a couple minutes to do that. And then we asked them to write it in the chat of our virtual meeting. And then once we had all the responses, we had an Excel template that was provided to us by OrgCode. We were able to plug in all of the answers we received from the agencies and then their number of votes for each prioritization criteria. And then the template automatically ranked all of the priorities based on the number of votes. So then once we finalized the template with those smaller meetings, we turned the rankings into a chart, which is what you'll see in that document. And then we brought that to our advisory committee for a final review to make any changes or clarification, and then ultimately approve the criteria for ongoing use. So that was our process for getting those top prioritization criteria.
Thanks. Let's hear from another perspective somewhere else in the country. Let's go to Red Deer. Same question to you, and I'm not sure which of you wants to take a crack at answering the question from Red Deer, but if you could outline the process that Red Deer used to establish a criteria and components to be considered in your dynamic prioritization process.
Yeah, you bet, Iain. I'll be taking that one. So we initially started coordinated entry a few years ago, back in 2015. So we were able to establish this in person And we started off with an analysis of our shelter data and our Housing First programs to identify those that were heavy system users. And that's highlighted in by identifying where people are sleeping and their chronicity. Then we also looked at, we wanted to target clients with high need. So initially we did focus strictly on tri-morbidity, but over time we've actually just used the SPDAT score, as those with tri-morbidity often have other challenges. So that score really captures that succinctly. And then we also had facilitated community dialogues and they really highlighted those sleeping rough to make sure that we were on track of where our data had kind of led us.
Excellent. So this is really interesting in far as we think about the different ways in which we can establish prioritization criteria. One of the other things that communities do is look to update their criteria or their process over time. Sometimes that which we start with is not that which we continue to use after we've had some runtime on the first part of the first kind of go through of prioritization criteria. So you learn things, right? You learn things like maybe we can capture information in different ways. Maybe a variable that we thought was really important is not. Maybe we're in a position where a particular population group is ending up disadvantaged through what we're doing through prioritization. So Alexandra, I want to bring you back into the conversation. And if you could tell us a little bit about the process used in Durham region for revising or updating your criteria or process in the community.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had originally rolled it out in June of 2020. And then earlier this year, we were kind of seeing that our chronic move-ins were still kind of low compared to our overall move-ins. So we wanted to pilot a new criteria through a Plan, Do, Study, Act or PDSA cycle with the help of our improvement advisor. And what we did was we just changed chronic homelessness to become the top priority factor for each population to ensure that clients who were experiencing homelessness or chronic homelessness were prioritized first for any housing opportunities to try to help increase the chronic move-ins for that population. So we brought the pilot idea forward to our advisory committee for discussion, and ultimately this was endorsed by them as well. So we started this in February. We revisited it after about 4 months, and we decided to keep moving forward with it for a few more months. So we're now in the process of revisiting the change to review the impact of it. And then we'll bring it back to our advisory committee again to decide if this is a change that we want to permanently implement just based on the data that we're looking at. So our coordinated access system in general is very much a work in progress. It's still very new to us. So we're definitely embracing the fail forward mentality and just taking feedback and changing things as we go. So I imagine the criteria will also continue evolving just as our population and community needs change as well.
Absolutely. And I really think for many communities who might be on the call today, one of the lessons that I think we can take away from the Durham experience is about putting chronic at the forefront of the prioritization criteria, or making sure that it's one of the top prioritization criteria. One, I think it stays true to the needs of the overall population in most communities where we really want to help people that have been homeless for longer periods of time. And secondly, it helps us reach other objectives from funders, right? Like reduction in chronic homelessness as per Reaching Home. Let's bring the region of Waterloo into the conversation. Pat, I'm glad you're with us today. Maybe you can walk through us a bit of what the experience has been like in the region of Waterloo, how your community has revisited and updated criteria since it was first developed.
Sure, thank you. So we developed our prioritization about 4 years ago, and it's a mixture of acuity, depth of need, and chronicity. So by and large, our prioritization categories really remain in place, but we currently have 400 people who are chronically homeless in our community. And so when we do a filtering and sorting of the information, we have a pool of people who end up being in the top area of priority. And so what we've added really is a matching process to the vacancies and trying to look at a few people and see who the best connection and best matching would be for each kind of opportunity. Maybe it's that someone has identified that they prefer to live in one community or another. Maybe they're more outgoing, maybe they're quieter, depending upon the conditions of the housing that's available. And we have a formal matching process with our supportive housing providers along the same way. The other thing that we're continuing to try to tweak, and our focus is becoming more and more about segmentation. We have a system by and large that's working well, but we're needing to kind of focus in on some different groups. And so right now we're looking at how do we revise and refine this for youth, for example. So we're opening a 40-unit supportive housing project for youth, and we're shifting to the YAP tool as part of the assessment of acuity and talking about what chronicity looks like for the youth population as opposed to the adult population. So that's one. And then we're noticing that on our prioritization list that people who are living rough are often getting placements. And so we're looking at how do we shift the prioritization to make sure that the proportions of options are coming up regularly for those who are living rough, but at the same time not wanting to incentivize people to get out of the shelter and live rough in order to meet the prioritization. So those are both kind of work in process, but they're ones that we're talking about.
And I think an important conversation to have, right? I mean, I definitely think the idea of making sure people rough sleeping are included as a prioritization criteria is commonplace, but you're absolutely right, Pat. We don't want to create an environment in any community where people think, well, the fast track to housing is sleeping rough, therefore I should vacate a shelter, or even in some instances, vacate other places where they may be staying with a friend or family member and go to the streets just because they think that's the fastest way. And so I appreciate some of the balance that you must be going through to try and make that work within Waterloo Region. Thanks, Pat. We haven't heard from Moncton yet, so I'm going to bring Dawn into the conversation. And what I'd like to hear a little bit about, Dawn, is how you're ensuring that program participants have voice and choice in the matter. In particular, voice and choice in matching, so that people that are being housed through our work of dynamic prioritization feel that they're part of the process as opposed to having decisions made for them. What are the thoughts you have to share from Moncton?
Thanks, Ian. Definitely, if we fast forward a little bit to future, it would be great if Moncton was in a place where we had multiple units to offer to an individual who's experiencing homelessness on our by names list. We're not quite there yet, but we do certainly value and respect housing choice. Not just because it's the right thing, you know, all of us require housing choice, but also because it's proven best practices when somebody has a choice of where they like to live or has that self-awareness of, thank you for offering me that unit, but I know I'm not going to succeed there because. So, you know, we do certainly try to instill that in our community. And so when we receive a unit and we use our prioritization process through our by names list, and we match a particular individual to that unit, the agency who's going to be supporting the individual will meet with them, meet with the landlord, with the client together, kind of really walk beside the client through that process. And if there's a reason why the client says, you know, I'm not interested in that unit, because there's a space for that conversation. And we don't then penalize them for that. You know, we keep them on our prioritization list and try to match them to the next available unit. There's even been situations in Moncton where individuals wanted the unit, but the landlord spoke up and said, I don't think this is going to be a match because, which we also appreciate. When that happens, we make sure that that person who was prioritized is considered for the next available unit in Moncton to see if it's an immediate match. So we actually put that person then on our coordinated access agenda to make sure we don't overlook that they were prioritized, they were matched. It wasn't a proper match, we'll say. And so now we keep them kind of at the forefront for the next available unit to see if it's a match again. We even go as far as to sometimes reach out to our landlord contacts or our NB Housing, we call it our housing authority, who has some rental supplements to see if we can find another unit rapidly for that person to better match.
Excellent. Michelle, let's hear from Kawartha Lakes. Let's put the same question to you. How is Kawartha Lakes ensuring the program participants have voice and choice in the prioritization and matching process?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So most of our by name list inventory is within our local housing corporation housing stock. But these opportunities aren't connected to our centralized waiting list, which is governed by the Housing Services Act. We actually match folks to market rent units to avoid the other legislation. So that really, for us, helps now prevent us from having these folks limited to the new refusal rules that are implemented and connected to that centralized waiting list under the Housing Services Act in Ontario anyways. So that's one piece. Another piece that we do is ensure that folks have choice is that they're not penalized, as Dawn mentioned too, if they do turn it down. We cover a really large geographic area, 7,000 square kilometers. So before we do any prioritization, that's almost the first filter we apply to the list. If the unit's located in Minden, then we're only going to be focusing on folks who have expressed that choice of preference, that that's where they would like to be housed. And we start from there and we do the filtering and prioritization and matching of our lists when there is a unit available. Going back to the piece about making sure folks aren't penalized, it has proven to provide us a few opportunities to talk and advocate with community partners around the importance of having choice and supporting these individuals to have choice. Sometimes there's opinions out there that if someone turns down this glorious housing unit, that they should have different opportunities for future housing options. And we feel very strongly against that. So it's just a good opportunity to just have a conversation to advocate for choice.
And I think what both you and Dawn have really highlighted in your processes is bringing to life the notion of nothing about us without us, right? So in the Kawartha Lakes, let's start right at the very beginning, naming some of those preferences geographically. In terms of where people want to go. And in both of your processes, you know, still having opportunity for people to say no and it not being punitive, right? The ability to continue to work with people, gather more information, refine the offers that we make going forward, and that is a bit of a process with some community partners along the way, for sure. Aaron, we haven't heard from you yet, and it's your turn to be part of the conversation. And in particular, what I want to drill down into now is this notion of exclusion potentially, and in particular, whether or not there's any population you're concerned may be disadvantaged through dynamic prioritization processes that you've established in Peterborough, and what are you doing to address it?
It's a great question. So there's actually two populations that come to mind with different solutions. And so the first population, we made a conscious effort to avoid this happening, but it still happens to a degree, I think, just because of the size of our list. So people who are on the low end of high acuity, for lack of better terms, they don't meet that absolute highest need. And so they're not getting caught as the top people being selected and put forward for programs. And so that becomes a bit of an issue. So what we're doing is we're going to be reviewing our inventory. Not all of our inventory is housing based. Some of it is intensive case management and rent supplement programs. So we'll be reviewing that to see if reallocation is needed to ensure that there are exits available for people on the list, no matter where they fall. The second group is families. So we realized that families with dependents were not being well served by the by name priority list, and they weren't meeting our community goal, which is keeping children out of emergency shelter. So we pulled together community partners, key members who work with families on the regular, and we just started talking about ideas. And I can't remember who said this, maybe it was Alexandra, I'm not sure, but they said they just brought everyone in and said, tell us all of your prioritization criteria you could include. And so we did that, and we came up with a lot of ideas. We did have to abandon some of them because it was a little too difficult to include. But essentially, we developed a specific prioritization approach for families, and we're finding that it meets the needs that we were looking for, which is keeping families out of shelter. And so that was about just over 2 years into our prioritization, that was really clear that there wasn't enough movement for the families that needed it. Yeah.
All right, well, don't go away, Aaron, because my next question is also for you. Just as a bit of a setup on the question, one of the issues that comes up in the space of dynamic prioritization, or at least can creep into some dynamic prioritization processes if not handled properly from the start, is when considerable subjectivity starts getting brought into the process. How are you in Peterborough ensuring, or doing the best you can anyway, that a considerable amount of subjectivity is not entering into prioritization, especially with concerns that you sometimes hear in some communities around such and such a person is not housing ready, and when that kind of creeps into discussion. So how are you dealing with that notion of subjectivity not driving the process?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely a challenge, especially because before the by name priority list, all of our decisions were made at a case conferencing table where people's selection for people going into units and programs was based off of open conversations and advocacy. In terms of, if I'm a case manager, I go and I advocate for my client. So it's a conversation we've had to move away from. So what we did is we changed the purpose of that table to be simply more like a supportive group for case workers in how they can connect their clients with other services, and not about the placement into units or programs. From the very beginning of the by name priority list process, it's not open to the entire community when there's a unit available and that names have been provided. That happens between the by name list coordinator, myself, and the provider of the service. Limiting the amount of people who are participating in the conversation. We certainly don't hide or obscure the results of that selection or anything, but we're not making announcements. And the reason for that is so that we're trying not to invite too many questions or people trying to jump in and advocate, well, my client wasn't on the list and they should be, and this is why. So that has been a shift. And so what we're really trying to remind people of is that now advocacy looks like you ensuring that your client has all their information updated on the by name priority list. So the shift is, advocacy used to look like this. You make enough phone calls, you attend enough meetings. Advocacy now looks like ensuring the information is accurate and up to date, and trusting that the system is making choices that are supporting the people in need in our community. And it's definitely a shift. There are still struggles with that, in that folks are still looking for that outlet. And I still receive that, but I always remind them that, you know, this has been a great conversation, and I always look forward to hearing the experiences of the people in our community and the staff trying to support them. But at the end of the day, this is how the system works.
What I love that you're sharing, Aaron, is part of this evolution of advocacy, right? And I do think for many community stakeholders in throughout the country, unlearning the approach of like, I will just be the champion for one person and go to enough meetings and say it enough time until they get served, to the system-based approach in advocacy. And I really loved what you said around advocating to make sure the documentation is ready and that they're good to go. It is a very helpful shift. Not the last time I'm going to ask you a question, Aaron, but I am going to switch back to Michelle for the same question from the neighbors in Kawartha Lakes. How is Kawartha Lakes ensuring a considerable amount of subjectivity is not entering into prioritization in your community, Michelle?
Yeah, so we are trying to diligently track those who are being potentially skipped over from other housing opportunities. So similar to some other areas, if someone, usually there's about up to 4 names provided for a matching opportunity, and we're tracking those who weren't selected. And upon the 4th time of, or 3rd time onto the 4th option and opportunity for matching, they are the only name that is put forward, just to ensure that no one is falling through the cracks, which is ultimately, I think, one big piece that Coordinating Access is trying to accomplish. So we do try to do our best to do that. That being said, we've been doing this for a while in Kawartha Lakes. We've been trying to be very bold at trying to house those with the highest acuity into our housing stock. Our new challenge that we're facing more recently is that we're consistently seeing a small number of folks in our community with really complex needs that are kind of exceeding some of the supports that we have in our homelessness serving system. And it's becoming quite a challenge. Also paired with the fact that we generally have one main housing provider who our folks on the by name list are being housed into their units. Although like the property manager connected to the local housing corporation is fantastic, social worker by background, is very socially minded, thank goodness. She has a really tough job of ensuring the balance of seeing a successful tenancy of that individual coming to that unit, but also managing the rest of that community too, and needing to see that community be well as well. So that is certainly a challenge we are trying to work through. One thing that we're going to attempt to do next year is try to support the local housing corporation to come up with a housing restriction chart. So similar to the shelter service restriction chart, is trying to transparently identify certain events that might happen in a tenancy and then document and outline transparently what the natural consequences will be of that, including, for extreme events that might lead, unfortunately, to eviction, what is the time out period for that individual before they're potentially given an opportunity into another unit owned by that housing corporation. So it's something we're going to try to do, because I think the housing corporation, they really care about every eviction they go through. They work really hard towards eviction prevention, and actually take things quite personally when they do have to see somebody be evicted. So I think this actually will help them also to look at this more from an objective, transparent process supported by the rest of the community. I'm also hoping too that for the rest of the community, it will kind of be a transparent process that will hopefully inspire them to really engage at an earlier point when tenancy struggles are starting to happen, helping partners to understand, like, we can't have the housing corporation staff and the supportive housing staff necessarily do this on our own. And sometimes wrapping around various supports is so important. So hopefully this will kind of drive that messaging home. So looking forward to attempting that process next year, just to ensure that we have a transparent process, given that we have one main housing provider who in reality now is seeing some folks cycle back, and there's a lot of history there. And so just building a process to ensure that we can objectively support them for future housing opportunities is something we feel is important for us to look at.
Sounds like you got some exciting work ahead in 2022 on that front. And I can definitely see the need for transparency in that place, right? It's very difficult to navigate ongoing connections and matchings if we're not really sure what the framework is for a particular provider. I mean, obviously, if one provider is saying there's a bit of a timeout period, that doesn't preclude potentially other housing options, but we need to be in a place where that's understood as a system context. Otherwise, we can end up with matching that just wouldn't work. So thank you for that, Michelle. I want to bring in Pat again from Waterloo Region, and shifting a little bit. One of the things that was talked about as the country kind of went down the road of coordinated access and in particular prioritization, is that it would help improve access to housing, that we could access housing faster through dynamic prioritization than we could without dynamic prioritization. So for you, Pat, how did dynamic prioritization improve your matching processes in Waterloo Region and or assist people in accessing housing faster than before dynamic prioritization?
So one of the things that we did as we moved into this prioritization system was we created some dedicated roles. So we have a team who is focused on the prioritization, getting data quality, making sure people are offer ready, document ready, as was mentioned before, so that when offers become available, we can act on them as quickly as possible. That's one thing we've really leaned into, the data quality, and that's a constant work in process. But we have a kind of dedicated team around that, and similarly, we have a dedicated team around landlord relationships. So part of that is finding landlords, problem solving on their side. Part of it is actually making sure that they continue to get paid when supports are removed, but the financial assistance remains. And so that real attention with landlords is something that we created very intentionally. And there's what we call a healthy tension within our system of trying to get different providers to recruit landlords, as well as having a dedicated team. So it's not always pretty, but it is actually showing good results. One of the things when we created, we actually have our scattered site supports, and we anticipated a higher number of people with lower acuity and then smaller number with higher acuity for longer support. But our data has shown over the time, we're supporting mostly people with longer term support. And, it's really the prioritization is working, because those folks are often considered hard to house, but they're actually getting housing and support and stabilization there. So we're happy about that, but in an environment of both and what I call a really dynamic work environment, we're now looking at rapid rehousing efforts and how do we prevent those with lower acuity from becoming chronic. So we're focusing on that, and at the same time looking at those who are stuck on our prioritization list, who are not getting offers, and so with that group, thinking about, instead of trying to look at a matching process that looks at units and who might be the best fit, let's look at these people who are stuck and not getting matched, and what do we need to build in our community? What do we need to create to meet those needs? So it's really a both and approach that's going on.
Thanks, Pat. And I think one of the things that is so important is this introduction of rapid rehousing in places that don't have it. I think that for those of you unfamiliar with the phrase, rapid rehousing is a very American way of talking about time-limited red supplements or time-limited supports or time-limited red supplements and supports with housing assistance. I still think the phrase works to describe what we do, but I think what is happening in the region of Waterloo is really helpful for consideration and dynamic processes, right? That we have different bands of needs, and we don't want a whole bunch of people to be aging into chronic just because we weren't able to engage in an intervention that was going to prevent that from happening. Thanks, Pat. I'll be coming back to you in a few minutes. I'm going to turn our attention to Dawn again. And Dawn, what I could say is that increasingly, and rightly so, equity matters have to be considered throughout the entire coordinated access process. So when we think about your experience in Moncton, I really have two questions I'd like to get into. One is, how are you promoting equity in housing access through dynamic prioritization? And two, how are you ensuring the program participants have voice and choice in the matching process so they are part of those decisions as opposed to being made for them? And in particular, I think you've done a good job on the latter part, but with your previous answer, but maybe you could drive a little bit further into how equity is being promoted in the work that you do in Moncton.
So here in Moncton, at our coordinated access meetings, we meet every 2 weeks, and we have now, we've advanced so much with our coordinated access team in Moncton that we pretty well, safe to say, we have almost all of our housing agencies at that table. So if I back up to probably even 1.5 to 2 years ago, before we even strengthened our processes a bit more, when a unit would become available, of course, that's when the kind of how do we put it, like the dynamic prioritization wasn't as successful. People started to get kind of wear their agency hats and advocating for their own clients to go into that one unit. And it often wasn't, it didn't end in a successful meeting. So we've since kind of looked at that to say, understandably so, we have some agencies that support specifically female, some that support specifically male, some that support specifically youth. We have some agencies that support specifically like really complex needs individuals, mental health and addiction barriers. So what we do when we all meet now, we created a process by way of when we get units, we kind of assign the agency the unit in order. So every agency is getting an opportunity to have a unit, and they're not all just being assigned to one agency, and an agency then feels like they have this need to fight for their clients. So it's a much more community approach. And it's really, it's been an amazing thing to watch, because now our meetings are, we have 3 units, and here's all the agencies, here's who had, you guys have, here's all the agencies who had clients recently in these. So now we're moving down through the list. And there's even sometimes where somebody now, like we have separate meetings where we do case consulting on unique situations, or people who are being skipped often, or complex situations that need to be separately prioritized. Now we even have situations where, even though such and such an agency is next in line for the unit, they'll say, well, let's let this other agency take it because that's who's better able to support that person. We even see situations now where we have an agency assigned to the unit, and then what happens, and we don't do this in the meeting, this happens outside of the meeting to avoid conflict and avoid bias. I will prioritize the list using the agency's criteria. So if they service just females, for example, I'll prioritize the list with just females, and I will give them, I'll put the list in priority order using our dynamic prioritization process, and give them a number of names to select from, and they'll go through them. And we actually discussed, when names are being skipped, we discuss why, to make sure it wasn't just because they jumped right down to Sally because they know Sally well, or, we actually sit together and say, okay, so we just skipped over X number of people. Can we make sure that we're doing our due diligence when we do that? Even sometimes it'll be, and so when it comes to, the clients on our by names list having a say, sometimes they might not want to work with a certain agency, or that relationship's just not working well, or it's broken down for some reason or another. Sometimes when we're doing a really good job of case management, we're also up, sometimes our clients get mad at us because we're, challenging in some cases. So other agencies are now speaking up to say, we can step in and do check-ins on that in that unit if you'd like us to help you out. So the collaboration and the community effort that's been taking place in Moncton has been really heartwarming.
Excellent, thanks, Dawn. And I think that this is a matter that we're going to increasingly have to be thoughtful of across many of our communities is notions of equity, gender equity, race equity, age equity, looking at who is being potentially disadvantaged by our list, doing our deep dive of our data to ask not just who are we getting into housing, but who are we not getting into housing, and being really sensitive to particular population groups that may get to a place where we're being too exclusive and we're missing the boat on certain population groups. And so when we have like gender specific services like you talked about in Moncton, that's a filtering process that hopefully will advance equity. And I think it's a great first step for moving forward in other equity considerations. Michelle, I want to bring you into the conversation again, and we're going to talk about action-oriented case conferencing. And in particular, I want to ask you, does Kawartha Lakes use action-oriented case conferencing as part of your dynamic prioritization process? And assuming you do, how did you design, organize, and deliver those case conferences effectively?
Yeah, so we do. I would say they're on a smaller scale, but that's not a bad thing either. So when we do have a housing opportunity available, 4 names, like I mentioned before, are pulled from the by name list that have been prioritized to meet the criteria associated with that supports attached to that unit. Initially, the local housing corporation property manager, our landlord, the support agency, and then the homelessness coordinator meet to review the names, and more so in conjunction with looking at that individual in light of the current dynamics at that building. Like I said, we are housing into community housing buildings. We're finding all of these buildings are becoming more vulnerable and having all sorts of unique dynamics attached to them. That changes sometimes from one person moving into a building. So I think we've been really recognizing and really leaning in on the social mindfulness that our landlord through the local housing corporation and property manager has. And we've seen and have learned from some past experiences where, for instance, for one particular building that's dedicated to housing nothing but folks who have experienced chronic homelessness, all of a sudden 80% of the population there were females. And that became an issue and created some interesting, concerning vulnerabilities for that population. So a complete unintended consequence. So from that and from some other experiences, we've kind of let ourselves apply a couple other filters based on the dynamics of those buildings and communities when looking at the first phase of that matching process. Only just because we've learned a lot. Sometimes we know someone's heading potentially into a unit and there's significant, in a small community, significant known conflict with the person next to them. And there's just some of those things and nuances in our small community that we are trying to apply some additional, subjectivity, but we're not making it feel like we're failing at this process because we're now letting some of that come in. But it's done in a way too where if we know so-and-so has been prioritized, we have a good impression that they're likely not to succeed in a particular unit because of very specific building issues going on or connections to somebody. It's not as if they're denied opportunity there. The local housing corporation usually has another unit coming up and maybe we'll swap and give preference to another unit as long as it's still meeting the community preferences of the individual themselves. And then of course, finally, we do our best to ensure that generally it looks like it's going to be a good fit, but ultimately the client always does have that final choice. And if we do our best in applying our judgment, quite honestly, sometimes with the dynamics that we are seeing in a community, and the individual chooses not to, that's totally fine. And like I've mentioned before, they're not penalized, but we've come to a place where we're letting it be okay that we do consider the dynamics of the building, especially with the history of the folks that we do know of in our community experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. Aaron, I want to bring you back into the conversation. I think this is a good question for us to pick up on, given what you shared in the last part. What does action-oriented case conferencing look like in Peterborough?
So we don't use action-oriented case conferencing as part of the selection and prioritization process. However, many of our housing and supportive programs are operated by the same service provider. And so I know that when I provide them names, they bring together a group of folks who support those programs to make those decisions. Because part of our process is that I can give you 4 names, but if you can perform a transfer from one by name list program to another that benefits the client, you're also free to do that, which in turn opens up a position somewhere else for someone to be taken off the list. So I know that those case conferences happen at the service provider level, but we noticed that when we started using our by name priority list, we had a big interagency case conferencing table that had literally everyone at it. And folks just stopped attending and stopped providing agenda items, and there wasn't a need there. But we still felt that we had to meet because otherwise we would be working in silos, even if we're following the same process. So now we have a system navigation case conference that happens twice a week for half an hour. And so what that table does is it's just 1 or 2 people from the key organizations, and they meet to discuss clients who are having difficulty accessing our service system, or clients who need to be transferred between programs or are in a dedicated housing unit or program and it's just not working out. And so that case conferencing actually is happening after the fact, after folks have been prioritized and served by our system. So it looks a bit different, but we still felt the need was there, even if we weren't using it as part of the selection.
Thanks, Aaron. Well, Red Deer, you've had a little break for a little while, so now we're going to bring you back into the conversation. And in particular, want to go in the direction of understanding community buy-in. So I'm not sure. Oh, it's Ryan this time. All right. How did you go about getting community buy-in in Red Deer for dynamic prioritization?
Yeah, you bet. I would say this is an area where we have learned over the years. When we first adopted our prioritization guidelines, as Shayla referenced earlier, there was a lot of data analytics that went into selecting the criteria. And a couple of years into the process, we were hearing from the community that there was some concern and just curiosity, I would say, around the prioritization criteria and do we have it right? And one of the great things is that our CAP guidelines are living guidelines and always open for discussion. And so we have a CAP executive table where we have those dialogues, and that had been flagged as an area we should have a dialogue. And one of the things that we learned internally from an administrative perspective is we, in many ways, knew what the data looked like and the community did not. And so a stroke of Shayla's brilliance, we came up with a good way to have a focused dialogue, and we asked them to provide us with the prioritization criteria that they wanted to see. And so we took that information and we built sample prioritization criteria. So we took the same prioritization list and reorganized it based on different criteria, and we provided that back to them. And that was probably one of the best things that we've done because the list changed very little. And that was really helpful for the community to see, was the little amount of change that those prioritization criteria made and how full the SPIDAT was. And it actually changed the dialogue in our community away from, did we have the prioritization criteria right, to, are we doing a good enough job on the SPIDAT? And so actually we then dug into the quality of the SPIDATs that were being completed and ensuring quality in that area, because there was such an understanding of how important that was to getting an individual placed appropriately in housing.
Shayla, anything you wanted to add to that? All right. So one of the mantras in the movement towards ending homelessness is to fail forward. We've heard variations of that today. As we make mistakes, we learn, we refine, we hopefully improve, we're hopefully growing. I'm going to see which, if any, of the panelists today can share thoughts on this question. If you could have a do-over for part of your prioritization process of designing and implementing your approach, in hindsight, what may have you done differently? Pat, I'm going to see if you're comfortable going first and responding to this question of, if you could have a do-over for part of your prioritization process, in hindsight, what have you done differently?
We sometimes talk about how COVID has been a gift in some areas, and it's really laid bare through the intensity of experience. And so really three themes that have come up for us. One is the youth. And I mentioned earlier, we have a rapid housing initiative funded project, which has allowed us to focus our prioritization with youth. And we wish we had done that originally, but we're getting to do it now because there is actually something meaningful to move forward on. So that's one we would have wished to have done better. A second is a couple of communities had mentioned involvement of people with lived experience and helping to set the criteria. And we really use best practice, we use providers, we use direct service workers, but we didn't do as robust a job as we could have with the voices of people who have lived experience. And their voices have become really amplified in COVID. And so it's a piece that, was really clear that something that we could have done better. And the third is the point in time count consultations in our area really wanted to focus on hidden homelessness. And so we were expanding the circle of who might be involved. And it led us to work more intensively with Indigenous and the Black community. And we realized that we don't even really know the questions to ask, because the terminology, the experience of homelessness is so different for those communities, because people lean in and provide support within, and so it's a group that we're pretty blind with. And really the point in time count is one, the first time we've actually had racialized information, and so it's a very big start, but it's it shows that we're not doing a good job of supporting this community. And so it's really illustrated for us and really showed that that's one area that we should have, could have, and still need to focus on in a better way.
Thanks, Pat. I'm going to bring in, let's see, Dawn, anything that you would share in terms of the things you would have done differently?
Yeah, definitely. The big thing in Moncton that right now, we do not have our by names list being populated from HIFIS. It's in the process, and we've learned that it's extremely challenging to convert. So for any community that's just starting this process or has the opportunity, it would be really, really wise to have that done first before you start embedding priority into your BNL, because it takes a long time to backtrack. So that's one thing for sure. What's kind of interesting about this conversation is I think that we all do have a chance to do it over, because like we in 2019, Moncton did a 3-hour in-person meeting where they invited all the agency staff and stakeholders to a meeting to discuss priority in our community. And that was in 2019. In 2020, we revisited that in a different way. We also launched some Facebook voting, if you would, to general public. And I think we need to be doing it every 6 months, because our community in Moncton is changing and growing all the time. Our resources are changing and growing all the time. And so the needs are often different. The priorities are often different. So we do have the opportunity to kind of improve the way we do priority. And one of the things would be to be doing it more often, and to kind of take a step back and say, okay, are we always asking the same agencies and the same stakeholders these questions, or are we bringing new perspectives in, grabbing onto agencies that maybe, secondary service providers of homeless individuals experiencing homelessness, or, are we missing youth? Are we missing Indigenous? Are we missing lived experience? And purposefully, mindfully bring those folks, invite those folks in to ask them, instead of always asking the same agencies, because you're just going to get the same answers all the time.
Yes. Thanks, Dawn. I'm going to give the final word to Marie in just a moment. We're just about out of time. I would like to just summarize and say thank you to our panelists for their wonderful insights, for their attention to detail and the response to the questions. I found it quite illuminating and instructive. Sometimes in this work, it's not what's pretty, it's what works. And I think we're seeing a little bit about how the sausage is made in dynamic prioritization, and hopefully you're finding that illuminating and helpful as you reflect upon the practice in your community of how you can make the process of prioritization more dynamic. And Marie, I'll turn it back to you for the final word.
Great, thanks, Iain. Thanks very much for facilitating, and thanks to our panel. It was super interesting to hear more about your systems and how they're evolving over time, and how you're doing things slightly differently to meet the needs in your community. I do just want to let you know, OrgCode's information is in here, the Canadian Alliance information is in here. For, again, all those who registered, we have recorded, and we will be sending this information out via email to everyone, and it will be posted on the Training and Technical Assistance website as well. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a really good rest of your Thursday.